The stale air in the gym hung heavy, thick with the scent of sweat and worn leather. Anya the Fury, Petrova, a woman built like a brick outhouse with a gaze that could shatter concrete, hammered at the heavy bag. Each punch and kick was a testament to years of relentless training, a symphony of controlled violence that had earned her the moniker and a shot at the featherweight title. But lately, the familiar rhythm of her training had been disrupted by a discordant note, a creeping unease that clung to her like the damp gym towel. It started subtly, with fleeting shadows in her peripheral vision, whispers just beyond the threshold of hearing. Anya, a woman who faced down opponents twice her size without flinching, dismissed it as stress, the pressure of the upcoming fight. Then came the dreams. They weren't the usual pre-fight jitters, the replays of sparring sessions or strategic breakdowns. These were different. They were landscapes of impossible geometry, cities built of bone and sinew under skies that bled a perpetual twilight. In these dreams she was always running, pursued by something unseen, something that exhaled a cold metallic scent that lingered in her nostrils even after she woke. The weirdness seeped into her waking hours. Her reflection in the gym mirror would sometimes flicker, showing her a face that wasn't quite hers, a face with eyes too wide, a mouth stretched into a silent, chilling smile. When she blinked, her own determined features would return, leaving her questioning her sanity. One evening, while running the wooded trails behind her secluded cabin, she heard it, a sound unlike anything she'd ever encountered. It wasn't an animal, nor the rustling of leaves. It was a low, resonant hum, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath her feet. The trees around her seemed to sway without a breeze, their branches twisting into grotesque shapes. Anya, a woman who had stared down rabid dogs and drunken brawlers, felt a primal fear grip her heart. She ran faster, the hum growing louder, until she burst back into the relative safety of her cabin. Inside, the hum persisted, a faint thrumming in the walls. She checked the electricity, the plumbing, everything she could think of. Nothing. The feeling of being watched intensified. She felt eyes on her, not from outside, but from within the very structure of the cabin. Her training suffered. The crisp focus she usually possessed was replaced by a jittery paranoia. Her sparring partners noticed. "Marco, you all right, Anya? You seem off." "Just tired," she'd lied, unable to articulate the creeping dread that was consuming her. How could she explain the feeling that her reality was fraying at the edges? One night, the dreams bled into reality. She woke up in the dead of night, the cabin plunged into an unnerving silence. But then she heard it, the softest of scratches coming from the corner of her bedroom. She reached for the baseball bat she kept beside her bed, her heart pounding in her chest. "Anya, VO, who's there?" Then another scratch, closer this time. Anya slowly rose, the bat held high. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw it, a dark, amorphous shape huddled in the corner. It wasn't large, but it seemed to writhe and shift, its edges blurring like heat haze. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her. This wasn't a burglar, this was something else, something wrong. The shape began to coalesce, slowly taking on a vaguely humanoid form. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Where its face should have been, there was only a swirling void, a blackness that seemed to suck the light from the room. Anya, despite the terror that threatened to paralyze her, reacted instinctively. Years of training kicked in. She lunged forward, swinging the bat with all her might. The wood connected with a sickening thud, but the creature didn't cry out. It turned its faceless void towards her, and Anya felt a wave of icy dread wash over her. It wasn't a physical attack, but something far more insidious, a psychic assault that clawed at her sanity. Images flashed through her mind, grotesque visions of decay and suffering, whispers of forgotten languages that promised unimaginable horrors. Anya stumbled back, dropping the bat. Her mind reeled, the boundaries between reality and nightmare dissolving. She saw things that couldn't be real, the walls of her bedroom twisting and contorting, the shadows stretching into impossible lengths, the air itself seeming to thicken and writhe with unseen entities. The creature took a step towards her, its long skeletal fingers twitching. Anya knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that this was the thing from her dreams, the pursuer in the bone cities. But Anya Petrova wasn't just any woman. She was the Fury. She had faced down fear countless times in the octagon. This was different, terrifyingly so, but the fighter's instinct, the ingrained refusal to back down, flickered to life within her shattered mind. She might not be able to fight this thing with her fists, but she could fight it. She had to. With a guttural roar that echoed the fury of her namesake, Anya charged. She didn't know what she was doing, what she hoped to achieve, but she wouldn't cower. She wouldn't break. She slammed into the creature, her body a weapon honed by years of discipline. It felt strangely insubstantial, like hitting a column of cold air, but the force of her charge knocked it back against the wall. The void where its face should have been seemed to intensify, and the psychic assault redoubled. Anya screamed, clutching her head, but she didn't let go. She kept pushing, her physical strength surprising even herself. As she pressed against the creature, she felt a cold, viscous substance oozing from its form. It felt like tar mixed with ice, and it burned her skin. The creature began to shriek, a sound that wasn't vocal but resonated directly within her skull, a symphony of pure agony. The room around them seemed to warp and distort even further, the shadows dancing with frantic energy. Anya didn't stop. She pushed with all her might, driven by a primal need to survive, to banish this nightmare from her life. The creature's shrieks grew louder, more piercing, until with a final shuddering convulsion it dissolved. It didn't vanish in a puff of smoke or fade into nothingness. It seemed to melt, the black, viscous substance spreading across the wall and then sinking into the wood, leaving behind no trace. The silence that followed was deafening. Anya stood there, panting, her body trembling, her mind still reeling from the onslaught. The room looked normal again, the shadows still, the walls solid. Had it all been a hallucination? But the burning sensation on her hands, where she had touched the creature, was real. And the lingering scent in the air, a cloying sweetness mixed with the metallic tang of blood, was undeniably present. Anya didn't sleep that night. She sat on her couch, the baseball bat clutched in her hands, her eyes wide and darting at every shadow. The world felt different now, tainted by the glimpse she'd been given into something dark and unknowable. The championship fight was just a week away. Before, it had been the most important thing in her life. Now it felt insignificant, a distant concern compared to the terror she had faced in her own bedroom. But Anya Petrova was a fighter. She had always been, and even though the world now seemed a much weirder and scarier place, she knew one thing for sure. She would step into that octagon, she would face her opponent, and she would fight. Because that's what she did. That's who she was. And maybe, just maybe, facing a human opponent wouldn't seem so terrifying anymore. But deep down, a cold knot of fear remained. She knew with a chilling certainty that whatever she had encountered in her cabin was not truly gone. It was waiting, lurking just beyond the veil of her reality, and it would be back. It was waiting, lurking just beyond the veil of her reality, and it would be back. The fury within Anya Petrova now had a new, far more terrifying target. The fury within Anya Petrova now had a new, far more terrifying The fluorescent lights in the St. Jude's shelter hummed with a tired, almost sentient drone. They cast a sickly yellow glow over the linoleum floor, worn smooth by countless shuffling feet. The air, thick with the mingled scents of stale sweat, disinfectant, and something vaguely metallic, clung to Elias like a damp shroud. He'd been in St. Jude's for 3 weeks, long enough to learn the rhythm of its misery, the unspoken rules of its fragile ecosystem. But tonight something felt different. It started subtly, a whisper in the echoing dorm room that wasn't quite a voice, a shadow flickering in the periphery that vanished when you turned to look. Elias, a man whose life had been a slow erosion of bad luck and worse decisions, was no stranger to unease. But this felt wrong. Old man Tiber, who slept in the bunk below Elias, was usually a symphony of snores and mumbled grievances. Tonight, however, he was silent. Too silent. Elias leaned over the side of his top bunk, the thin mattress groaning under his weight. Tiber's eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, but they didn't seem to see anything. They were milky, like overcooked eggs, and a thin trickle of something dark and viscous was leaking from the corner of his mouth. Elias called his name, a dry rasp in the cavernous room. No response. He climbed down, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached out a hesitant hand and touched Tiber's arm. It was cold, unnaturally so, like touching marble in a meat locker. Panic began to prickle at the edges of his composure. He backed away, his gaze sweeping across the other occupants of the dorm. Most were still, shrouded in their thin blankets, but a few were stirring, their movements jerky and unnatural. One man, a gaunt figure named Silas, who always smelled faintly of gasoline, was sitting upright in his bed, rocking back and forth with a vacant smile plastered on his face. His eyes, usually darting and suspicious, were fixed on some unseen point in the darkness. Then came the sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking like fingernails tapping on a hollow surface. It seemed to be coming from the far end of the dorm near the communal bathroom. The clicking grew louder, more insistent, and a low, guttural moan joined it, a sound that seemed to claw its way up from the depths of someone's soul. Elias wanted to run, to bolt out of the shelter and into the cold night, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. He had nowhere else to go. He was trapped. He edged towards the bathroom, the clicking and moaning growing stronger with each step. The other occupants of the dorm were now moving more erratically. Some were twitching, others were making strange, strangled noises. The air grew heavy, charged with a palpable sense of dread. He reached the bathroom door, which was slightly ajar. A sliver of pale light spilled out into the darkened dorm. He hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. He pushed the door open. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. The bathroom was small and cramped, with 2 stained sinks and a single grimy toilet. Standing in front of the mirror, its surface cracked in a spiderweb pattern, was Mrs. Gable, the shelter's kindly, if somewhat eccentric, cook. But this wasn't the Mrs. Gable he knew. Her back was to him, but her head was tilted at an impossible angle, her grey hair hanging down like a tangled curtain. The clicking sound was coming from her mouth, a rapid, staccato rhythm, as her jaw moved in a way that seemed anatomically impossible. And then she turned. Her eyes were gone, replaced by 2 gaping black holes. Her skin was stretched taut and pale, and her lips were peeled back, revealing rows upon rows of tiny, needle-sharp teeth. The moaning sound was coming from deep within her throat, a wet, gurgling noise that spoke of unimaginable suffering. Elias stumbled backward, a strangled cry escaping his lips. He wanted to scream, but his vocal cords seemed paralyzed with terror. Mrs. Gable, or whatever it was, took a step towards him, her body moving with a jerky, unnatural gait. He scrambled back into the dorm room, his eyes wide with horror. The other residents were now fully in the grip of whatever was happening. Silas was banging his head against the wall, a sickening thud echoing through the room. A young woman named Maria was clawing at her own face, her nails leaving bloody trails on her cheeks. The clicking sound was spreading. He could hear it coming from other rooms now, a chorus of unsettling taps that seemed to be closing in. The air grew colder, and a strange, sweetish odor filled his nostrils like rotting flowers. He backed into a corner, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. There was none. The only door led back to the main hallway, and he had a terrifying feeling that whatever had infected Mrs. Gable had spread throughout the entire shelter. Then he saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of his eye. It was tall and thin, its form indistinct in the dim light. It seemed to writhe and shift, like smoke in a gentle breeze, and from it came a whisper, a voice that was both chillingly soft and impossibly loud, filling his mind with a terror he had never known. "Shadow, you are all welcome home." The clicking grew louder, closer. He could feel something cold and clammy touch his hand. He looked down and saw Tiber's hand, his milky eyes now focused on Elias, a grotesque smile stretching his lips. The dark fluid was still leaking from his mouth, but now it seemed to pulse with a faint inner light. Elias opened his mouth to scream, but the sound died in his throat. He felt a sharp pain in his arm, like 1,000 needles pricking his skin. He looked down and saw Mrs. Gable's teeth sinking into his flesh. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the shadow, tall and thin, its form now coalescing into something vaguely humanoid, its eyeless face turned towards him with an expression of infinite, terrifying hunger. The clicking continued, a relentless, rhythmic sound that echoed through the silent, haunted halls of St. Jude's shelter, a lullaby for the damned.
The afternoon sun, warm and inviting, streamed through the supermarket windows. It was Wednesday, a perfectly ordinary Wednesday. A gentle breeze played with the leaves outside, birds chirped. Inside, the supermarket hummed with the usual sounds, carts squeaked on linoleum floors, registers beeped, people chatted quietly. It was also normal. A little girl, no older than 7, skipped beside her mother. They picked out apples, her small hand reaching for a bright red one. Her mother smiled. Everything felt safe, familiar, just another day. As they moved down the aisle, a shiver ran down the mother's spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. The air, a moment ago warm and comforting, felt suddenly cold. It was as if the very atmosphere had shifted, bringing with it an unsettling chill. The happy chatter of shoppers faded, replaced by a low, indistinct murmur. She stopped, brow furrowed, trying to understand the sudden change. Looking around, she noticed the other shoppers. They too seemed to sense it, the strange shift in the air. They moved slowly, their faces pale and drawn, as if drained of life and energy. Their eyes seemed vacant, lost in some internal world, disconnected from the reality around them. A shiver, stronger this time, ran down her spine. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the cold. The little girl, sensing her mother's unease, tugged at her skirt. Her wide eyes were filled with worry. "Mommy, I'm scared," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the strange humming that now filled the air. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The mother hugged her close, her heart pounding. She tried to stay calm, but the fear was growing inside her. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. She could feel it in her bones, a deep, unsettling dread that she couldn't ignore. A can of beans, seemingly of its own accord, rolled off the shelf and clattered to the floor. The mother jumped, pulling the little girl closer. The murmuring grew louder, now resembling hushed whispers, but she couldn't make out the words. Shadows stretched and twisted along the aisles, growing longer and deeper as the light seemed to dim further. The air grew thick and heavy, making it hard to breathe. Fear, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat. "Mommy, let's go!" the little girl pleaded, burying her face in her mother's coat. Her small body trembled. The mother, her eyes darting around, nodded. They had to get out, now! Section 4. The Man with the Straw Hat. They hurried towards the exit, their footsteps echoing in the unnatural silence that had descended. The air was thick with an eerie stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. As they neared the front, a figure stepped out from the aisle, blocking their path. The sudden appearance was startling, almost as if he had materialized from the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a straw hat that shadowed his face. His presence was both imposing and mysterious, casting an unsettling aura. "Excuse me?" the mother stammered, her voice trembling. The man didn't move. He remained as still as a statue, his silence adding to the tension. He just stood there, his presence radiating a chilling stillness. It was as if time itself had frozen around him. The murmuring, the whispers, seemed to emanate from him, swirling around him like a dark cloud. The air was filled with an almost tangible sense of dread. The mother, her heart pounding in her chest, took a step back. Fear gripped her, making her movements slow and deliberate. She pulled the little girl closer, her eyes fixed on the man's shadowed face. The protective instinct surged within her, overriding her fear. He tilted his head slightly, and for a fleeting moment, she could have sworn she saw a flicker of a cold, knowing smile beneath the brim of his hat. It was a smile that sent shivers down her spine, hinting at secrets best left undiscovered. Section 5. An empty street. Panic surged through her. The night was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and frantic, echoing in her ears. She spun around, searching for another way out, but the man was there, blocking their path. His presence was suffocating, like a dark cloud looming over them. He hadn't moved, and yet he was everywhere. His shadow seemed to stretch and bend, consuming the light around them. Tears welled up in the little girl's eyes. "Mommy, please," she whimpered, her voice trembling with fear. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, leaving behind an unsettling calm. The lights flickered back to their normal brightness. The whispers ceased. The man was gone. It was as if he had never been there. They rushed out of the supermarket, the cool evening air washing over them. Relief mixed with confusion as they tried to make sense of what had just happened. The street outside, usually bustling with activity, was deserted. It felt like a ghost town, every shadow hiding a potential threat. No cars, no people, just an eerie silence, the kind that makes you question reality. The mother looked back at the supermarket, its brightly lit windows now seeming like mocking eyes. What had happened? Had it been real, or just a figment of their imagination? Or had her mind played tricks on her? She didn't know. The uncertainty gnawed at her, leaving her feeling more vulnerable than ever. And the most terrifying part was, she had a sinking feeling she would never truly know. The unknown loomed over her, a constant reminder of the night's events.